Good evening, welcome to the Court Talks. It's great to see so many of you here on such a lovely sunny evening. This is the last in this academic year's Modern and Contemporary Research Seminar. So I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Laura Guy, who is a lecturer in History and Theory at Glasgow School of Art, where she also coordinates postgraduate research for the School of Fine Art. As I know many of you know, because I can see lots of people have come here to hear Laura, she has published widely on queer and feminist visual culture, including editing Phyllis Christopher's artist book called Darkroom, San Francisco Sex and Protest, 1988 to 2003, which came out in 2022. And she's also co-editor of the fascinating collection of essays, Queer Print in Europe, that also was published in 2022. That was an output from the research project Cruising the 70s, Unearthing Pre-HIV and AIDS Queer Sexual Cultures. Laura's also curated a number of important exhibitions, most recently as part of the collective Radcliffe Hall, including Hot Moment at Porto Italia, which featured the work of Tessa Boffin, Ingrid Pollard and Jill Poisner. I'd recommend everyone to keep an eye out for Laura's next project, which is a special issue of the British Art Studies Journal, looking at queer art in Britain since the 1980s, which she is co-editing with Fiona Anderson, Flora Dunster and Theo Gordon. And Flora and Theo are here as well, if you want to talk to them about that. Before we start, I'd just like to thank Diego Artiche in the Research Forum for facilitating this evening's event, and also Noah for his tech support. So I'm very much looking forward to Laura's talk today, which is titled Other Printers, Making Images Read as Lesbian. So if you can join me in welcoming Laura.
Hi everyone, I'm just going to keep an eye on the time. So I'm going to try and speak for not longer than 40 minutes, which seems like quite a lot of time to speak for anyway. And then there's going to be time for questions and then sort of more informal discussion at the end, with a glass of wine, I think, Catherine said. The sort of nature of the work that I look at and will be sort of sharing with you today is it's lesbian, whatever that means, and I guess we might sort of get into that a little bit. But it's also overtly sometimes sort of dealing with picturing sex and sexuality, and there are some images that I'll be showing, all with context, but I thought I'd just let you know that before we get started. So the subtitle of this talk, Making Images Read as Lesbian, references a 2006 essay by Tee Corinne, in which she reflects on her collaborations in the 1970s with a sister photographer, her friend and former lover, Honey Lee Cottrell. Together, she writes, we explored ways to make images that read as lesbian. Corinne began working as a photographer in the 1970s, and like Cottrell, she was drawn to explicit images of lesbian sexuality, and wanting to make those in the absence of images depicting lesbian sex made by lesbians. In such an absence, the idea of making images rather than a more conventional idea of taking them implied for Corinne and her contemporaries that there was creative and practical work to be done, so that images, rather than being available to be captured, would have to be conjured. Making Images Read as Lesbian is also the title under which I'm currently trying to organise about 10 years' worth of research on the subject of lesbian sex photography, a sort of awkward terminology. Could also think of it as lesbian erotica. And this project really pivots around one magazine on our backs, which had the strapline, the magazine for the adventurous lesbian. On our backs was published in San Francisco from 1984 until 2006, although not continuously and under different sort of iterations and different publishers. What I wanted to think through with you today, and this is the sort of the talk. On the one hand, I think some of the work might be familiar to some of you who are here because it's work that I've been publishing for some time, and on the other, so I hope you'll bear with me, those of you who do know it, really sense of sort of trying to wrestle with that work into something that will eventually become a book project, or hopefully soon will become a book project because I've been with it for so long now. And I've been doing this work, as Catherine sort of indicated, not only through publishing, but also through curating and through working really closely with the archives of some of the photographers who I'm going to talk about today. And that work has sort of felt really necessary for reasons that the work with these archives has felt really necessary for reasons that I'll sort of go on to discuss. But particularly that many of the collections that I work with are held or were held until recently in photographers' homes. And uncatalogued, not available within sort of institutional archives. And so this has kind of required quite a lot of kind of leg work, partly because I enjoy that approach and partly out of a sort of necessity in terms of, I think, quite urgent questions about the precarity and vulnerability of some of these archives at this time. So the idea that making and reading are necessary to the production of lesbian meanings within images of sex and sexuality is threaded through On Our Backs magazine, as it is the work that the work that I'm going to share with you today. There are many photographs that appear in the print periodical. I'm just going to start. I've got. So these are images both by Tee Corinne, and in a way they sort of demonstrate a kind of a problematic or a sort of proposition that I'm trying to kind of get at in the research. So the first is an image from 1977, Protea. And the second is an image that was published in 1984 in the first issue of On Our Backs. And Tee Corinne talked about how with the emergence of On Our Backs magazine, she was finally able to publish images that she felt she'd wanted to make for a long time, and she'd been making for a long time, but which hadn't had a kind of a venue for, or a platform for publication. And with that, there's a sort of shift in terms of the work that she was making and the work that she was sharing from this sort of earlier work in the 70s to the kind of 1980s. And it's that sort of shift that it's partly what the book tracks. So On Our Backs, like many magazines, they're important locations for histories of photography, and they're also invaluable archives for tracking temporal shifts in history. As Laurel Foster writes in her book Magazine Movements, a single magazine can be a kaleidoscopic representation of feminism, with different elements appearing, merging, overlapping and contradicting in relationship to other activities of the movement beyond the magazine. So anyone who's worked with magazines, and I know there's some of you in this room, will understand the pleasures and difficulties associated with wrestling such large quantities of unwieldy content. In the instance of On Our Backs, this task means confronting the broader predicament of lesbian art, if not lesbian visibility in general. Lesbian art is both a history of absence and, as Corinne put it in 2002, of abundance. As a means to work through this paradox, so both an abundance of images and an abundance of images that were made to meet paucity of representation, making and reading allow me to link the materiality of the image, which was so important to Corinne and her contemporaries, to the contexts in which these images were produced and circulated, their material conditions of production. In 2014, which is when I really began this project, I published a short essay, Queer in Practice, that reflected on the emergence of kind of new queer photography in the 2010s. In order to do this, I argued that it was necessary to return to photographic practices of the 1980s, which were instructional in the way that images and queerness had co-constituted one another. There I wrote that like many communities, groups that ally through queerness often affirm relationships through photographs that circulate both off and online. Yet, if there is nothing essential about queer, there also cannot be anything essentially queer about photography. In order to think of the two together, it seems only possible to look at how they coincide at particular moments. So in many ways, making images read as lesbian is the result of this project and the thinking that began then. And that really began at a time when, as many of you will know, there was increased visibility of queer and feminist practices beginning to be sort of discernible in more mainstream sort of art spaces in the kind of art and photography world. And it also happened at a time that sort of around 2017 marked the anniversary of the 50 years of the Sexual Offences Act in England and Wales. So it was really a sort of moment where certain narratives about the history of queer art and photography were coming to form and maybe concretise in ways that felt overdetermined and where the sort of same old gaps were beginning to, or you know, that never went away, were sort of shown in a very sort of precise way. So at that time, alongside people like Catherine and others, really thinking about how feminism and histories that were beginning to be mapped to feminist art were often neglected the contribution of queer practitioners, and similarly how histories of queer art were neglecting feminism. That in the words of Catherine Lord, writing in 2007 for the catalogue of WAC, Feminist Art and Revolution, feminism is a category I choose not to split from homosexual, from lesbian, or from the oppositional politics implied by the word queer. So moving from questions of visibility, which were really at the root of some of these sort of major kind of survey exhibitions, like Queer British Art at Tate, to questions of making and reading, allowed such exchanges between feminism, lesbian and queer to be read and remade. And that's felt like an increasingly important sort of political project, I think, in recent years, as we're sort of watching ideas about and sort of politics surrounding lesbian identity kind of solidify in relation to trans exclusionary sort of feminist positions. So this focus on making and reading was also to shift thinking about a period of photography away from conceptions of identity, that the image and by extension the camera is an arbiter of visibility to lesbian subjects, to questions of labour and reproduction. The work of making and sharing images constitutes not only a form of witnessing, but that it is in itself a process of community building. So in this talk today I want to share this lesbian history of queer and feminist photography that I've been working through, and to concentrate on two areas. The first is the idea of the handmade as a material condition of lesbian images in their histories, or and specifically the archive that I'm interested in working on. And the second is a section of the project that locates context of production surrounding lesbian sex photography really at its inception. So focusing here on the home as both a space of making and of reading. Those are some images of covers of On Our Backs. I'm not going to talk so much about On Our Backs today. I thought maybe I'd focus on this sort of before On Our Backs in a way, a kind of pre-history of this sort of moment in the 1980s when lesbian sex photography really becomes sort of much more sort of available and begins to sort of circulate, at least from sort of certain urban centres. So Jill Posner's images of graffiti circulated widely in the 1970s and 1980s, and you might have seen them recently in Women in Revolt. Sometimes crude, other times sharply funny. The graffiti that Posner photographed and collected in Spray It Loud, a slim photo book published in 1982, reflects the signature struggles of the British left in this period. The book's typology of delinquent typography is comprised of feminist tags and anti-racist slogans, calls for social housing and for nuclear disarmament. Best known are her photographs of lesbian feminist defacements of billboard advertisements. All of these black and white photographs depict an image within an image, a kind of double vision that indicates the complex engagement with media that the simplicity of graffiti seems to belie. In one, the bottom of a debris-littered pavement, on one side by a brick wall, tendrils of ivy frame the left-hand corner. This image within an image is a public work, a billboard advertising the company Rest Assured Bed. In the advertisement, a model lies on her front in the bed, its velveteen headdress shaped like the open half of a clamshell. Enough of her pearly skin is visible to indicate that she would be naked apart from a tangled white sheet, which pulls away to reveal slender legs and the seat detail of a sprung mattress. She gazes out seductively. "We can improve your nightlife," reads the advertiser's slogan. "Join Lesbians United," someone has retorted, scrawled in dark spray paint in irregular capital letters. Two interlinked Venus glyphs punctuate the writing, two dykes holding hands on the street and laughing between themselves. Posner, who was the first lesbian playwright to work with the Gay Sweatshop Theatre Company, a collective founded in 1974, was committed to many of the causes represented in her photographs. Rooted in a grassroots critique of the documentary tradition that emerged in Britain contemporaneously, in the sense that this critique emerged out of interactions between photography and political movements. So in fact, many of the photographers that I'm interested in, and I think sort of part of the kind of perversity of the project is that they were not so interested in academic debates or what they perceived to be sort of academic debates around sort of emergent lesbian and gay kind of studies and perspectives about sort of photography and the politics of representation at the time. In fact, they were quite hostile to them at times. And many, not so much these images, but although they are, even Posner's approach at this time was informed by and influenced by a desire to, I guess a sort of desire to emulate certain street photographers that were sort of working in the kind of early part of the 20th century. And then similarly, some of the, Cottrell, Corinne, there's a real investment in very kind of modernist kind of ideals about the photographic image, which really challenge sort of contemporaneous debates about and critiques of the photographic image that are simultaneous, and that sort of the kind of simultaneity, but the tensions between these positions are something that really interests me about the archive. So as well as the two books dedicated to her graffiti images, Posner also reproduced graffiti works as postcards, what Mandy Merck once referred to in an editorial for a collection of lesbian postcards as the world's most indiscreet medium. Posner's photographs trace a line of lesbian feminist anger through the street in the decade that lesbian was carved out as a political sign by activists associated with the women's liberation and gay liberation movements. Slogans such as lesbians fight or lesbians mothers rule okay state lesbian presence unambiguously, but written in an amateur hand, quickly and inexpertly, spray painted onto billboards, brick walls, the side of a newspaper van, also ephemerally. Walking the same streets in London today to get to this talk, both architecture and infrastructure are radically changed. Posner's photographs are a residue of these public lesbian signs of the 1970s and 1980s, finger marks that suggest they were here. Graffiti leaves an awkward trace, one that is assured on the street and yet indelibly marked by its own disappearance. As I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, documenting lesbian experience has often involved a kind of illegitimate writing, a strange play of presence and absence. Catherine Lord writes of the ontological impossibility of lesbian visibility. So this graffiti opens up, and Jill Posner's images of graffiti in particular, open up questions about lesbian visibility and also about lesbian authorship. Graffiti is not bound up in making the city more beautiful, it's not bound up in value, quite the opposite. The destruction of property is at the centre of these works. The opening sequence of Barbara Hammer's 1974 Didactics, the earliest circulated works to feature lesbian-made images of lesbian sex, is written by hand too. And I'm afraid I don't have a screenshot of this, but so I'll describe it. An absence of existing representations legitimised the claim that this was the first lesbian-made film of lesbian sex, but also the hand of the author, an authentic lesbian presence. The title to the film fills the screen, written on a wall in large white letters. The S is finished by brush, extended from a body, the filmmaker's perhaps out of frame. The neat swoosh makes the intention of the tactic plural. A film that is considered among the earliest lesbian-made representations of lesbian sex is introduced by an illegitimate writing practice, one that could as easily be on the surface of an abandoned urban lot as the area in the bucolic scene that follows in the film. The graffiti contextualises what we're about to see. Dyke is rendered as an illegitimate intervention, but it's no less visible. Before she began to produce films, Hammer was warned by a teacher that surviving as an artist was like living in a dark hole all alone. At that time, which I guess is why you all became art historians, at that time she writes in her biography, and I quote, it's a long quote, I shuddered at the thought of isolation, but felt inspired by his confidence in me. The following week, I commandeered an empty classroom, one flight below the painting studio. I tacked a long roll of 3-foot wide butcher paper to one end of the room and proceeded to unfurl it and tack it on the walls around the room. Here was my dark hole. Here I would stay until I found my way, my stroke, my handwriting. The idea of handwriting conjures a style that is singular. Graphology is a practice that suggests that handwriting can tell us something about the personality of its author. It is a signature or a tag that provides a tell. For anyone who knows Hammer's work, as many of you do, these opening lines to her biography describe a surprisingly conventional idea of what an artist does. It's bind really to the authentic, to authenticity. Hammer's desire to make spoke to an absence of representation, like many of the photographers whose work I'll introduce, but also the illegitimacy of lesbian representation. In the opening shots of Didactics, joining of lesbian, or in this case Dyke, with graffiti, indeed allowing the sign to appear through the medium graffiti, conveys the complex dynamics of visibility that have underpinned Hammer's work as much as it has much of lesbian visual culture. Hammer's attempt to forge a signature that could be read as lesbian was coupled with a desire to make images that read as lesbian. Indeed, these two things were intertwined, her biography giving evidence to the authenticity of the image that she pursued. An identity becomes a tactic, a strategy, a sign. This opening sequence frames a career, Hammer's, in which lesbian is turned from an unpracticed hand into an artist's practice. Jill Posner is a very different kind of artist. and she did not always document her acts of vandalism, especially early on. Speaking to her friend, the writer Susie Bright, in 1995, Posner describes how she didn't think to take a camera to direct actions that she participated in the early 1970s. At that time, I never photographed it. I'd do it and then leave it. Then I'd see the pictures of the next day in the paper, photographed by some journalist, she says. Graffiti is stubborn, but it's not permanent. Posner's work is conscious of this ephemeral presence, of their ultimate disappearance, their corrupted legibility and legality. Spray It Loud, her first book, is dedicated to the vandals who take the risk. The indelible mark of authorship often lingers over artworks, but here the rule of law stops lesbian authorship being properly named. Tags function like signatures, but not fully. Trace, Kim, Donna, Tracy, Lorna appear in another image of graffiti taken by Posner. The traces of anonymous hands that I encounter within this body of Posner's work resonate with the made by and made for lesbian photography that my research turns to, and not only because when she moved to San Francisco in 1986, she became the first named photo editor of On Our Backs. I'm hedging here because there's Mandy is in the audience. You get quite a lot of citation here. So in her essay, The Lesbian Hand, Mandy Merck envisages a dialectical image with the hand both organ and product of labour. Cruising films for the hand's appearance, she asks if the lesbian hand is a daunting prospect for the male spectator, what is its function for lesbian spectators? If all fetish derives from lack of fantasy, is the lesbian hand a fetish? Is it a phallus? Circling the work of Teresa de la Ritas and Judith Butler, Merck comes to her own conclusions. Considering the promise of authentic lesbian sex in the work of Wachowski's film Bound, a promise potentially fulfillable because of the role played by Susie Bright as lesbian sex consultant to its directors, Merck writes, and I quote, "The hand can represent binding commitment. It also does so as an instrument of production, the process that materializes representations of sexuality and sexualities as representations. In Bound," she writes, and this is a quote again, "women get away with the money and the jewel of female desire, and they do so not by erotic conquest, but by a freely given love that binds each other, and that is made by hand." So in thinking about making and thinking about reading, I want to foreground labour in order to sort of pull away from this kind of paradox of visibility, a trap of lesbian photography. One of the reasons to do so is that On Our Backs really emerged into and became a part of and developed an economy of lesbian sex. Maybe not a particularly successful one, although I think that's, it's an uneven story, in fact. It was a magazine mostly funded through sex work of one kind or another. It included advertisements for consumer goods, for toys, for books. It was very attached into sort of lesbian sex toy industry that sort of became sort of viable at a similar time. New sort of small businesses dealing with levelware, and I mean, in a way, I think this is why this history of lesbian photography is, you know, on the one hand, it's quite well known within our community, and then on the other, it's quite derided. So my interest is in looking at economies, consumers, modes of production and reproduction that all contribute to this project of making by hand, so that an economy of images as well as culture and community emerges. So I'm just going to turn now for the last part of this talk to thinking about one site of production, and that's the space of the home as a site of production of lesbian sex photography and also filmmaking in the 1970s. I'm going to begin with an anecdote. The space of the home is also a site of production. It looks like the other houses on the street. Like the other houses on the street, small details allow conclusions to be drawn about its occupants. A walled area outside the front door is filled with odd pots that burst with unwieldy plants. Where a garage might house a car, a large glass window reveals the industry of an artist's studio. Peering nosily from the street, you can make out shelves of books, a large desk, a rectangle of tracing paper stuck to the window. I think Lizzie might recognise this description. Positioned high on a hill in a city I know well, the facade of the building shows 2 levels hiding one of its floors. When the estate was built in the mid-1990s, a deep channel was made in the side of the hill, foundations laid and the road established on the slope. When you step into the hallway, there are stairs that lead to the top of the house and there are stairs that lead down. Looking out of the windows on the top level, you can see the sunset over the city skyline. The welcome in this house is warm between friends, but this is the first time that cardboard boxes have been laid out for my arrival. Like the rows of houses, these are uniform, made to hold files in generic office settings. The content is anything but uniform. Books, magazines, paper, ephemera and photographs made by Phyllis Christopher, who lives there with her partner, artist Kate Sweeney. The photographs are held in outsized black portfolios, stuck to dark sugar paper that is interleaved between plastic sheets. Sometimes multiple images are included in one pocket, surfaces overlapping. These photographs are carefully printed, sepia-toned. Some show figures in clubs or on the streets at protests. Others are from studio shoots. In all of them, sexuality oozes, whether politicised on marches or staged intimately between performers, no less political. The photographer, one protagonist, among others. Flicking through the photographs, one also encounters narratives about the photographs, how they were made, who they were made by, where they were shared. In this house, the collection of papers is referred to fondly but jokingly by its occupants as the archive. Since my first visit in 2015, it has become a destination for other younger dykes, all of us seeking interactions with the owners as much as the images and other materials held within it. Being introduced to a person's work in their home is a distinctive, emotionally charged, contextually rich experience. A photographic archive like Phyllis's, which has until recently only been publicly available through print media, presents different preservation issues to those that porn scholars have identified in relation to video. Whereas home video technologies represented increased opportunity for the production of queer pornographic material, Phyllis began to lean toward more sensual erotic expressions in her photography. At the same time, homophobic censorship laws impeded which sex acts could be depicted and shared in print, and cheap printing necessitated by limited resources greatly affected the quality of reproductions. The material conditions in which queer print is produced and circulates offers possibilities for politicised aesthetic forms, but there are also limitations. Encountered in the flesh, Phyllis's photographs, which she prints and turns herself at home or in community darkrooms, display her skill as a technician, and reveal the queer contribution to a fine-grained tradition. Researching, I learned that, as well as being used to tone photographs, sepia preserves the longevity of the print. So this is just one experience of working closely with a photographer, and I did so with Lizzie Homersham toward the book Darkroom that Catherine mentioned at the beginning, which was published by Bookworks. And publication has been a really important part of preservation works in relation to these archives, and is an extension, I think, of these questions of making and reading that encircle this work both then when it was made. Phyllis was working from the late 1980s through the 1980s. I mean, she's still working, but the sort of period that she was on our backs was for between 88 and 2003, which is what the book really looks like. So to finish, I want to consider the home as a space of production as part of a larger piece that really thinks about printing and its relationship to making and reading images, and especially to do so in order to conceptualised the emergence of lesbian sex photography, really in the 1970s, although its roots, were really grounded in the 1960s as well. Lisa Gitelman tangles with printed documents as epistemic objects, evidential structures in the long human history of clues. Documents, she writes, and I quote, are integral to the ways people think, as well as to the social order that they inhabit. Gitelman wrestles with the notion of print culture as overly expansive, as she asks, and again I quote, how widely, how unanimously, and how continuously can the meanings of printedness be shared, and what exactly are their structuring roles? To look at the histories of feminist and lesbian cultural production, especially that associated sort of overtly with political activism, is to deal with print cultures. On Our Backs grew from a newsletter which was published by Samwa. Samwa was the first lesbian SM group established in the late 1970s in San Francisco, but with members elsewhere across the US and sort of eventually wider still, but mostly sort of situated in North America. The journal, as you can, the newsletter, as you can see from this image, these images. I found a copy of. It might have been Jill burning the sex shop, but it was highly illustrated, often with found images as well as sort of new photographic work. These are the mock-ups for which would be taken to the printer, so you can see a kind of combination of tape, of found images, sort of collage within the page, Tipex and so on. They're really informative of the kind of roots of On Our Backs and their approach to publishing photographs, which is something that I'm not going to talk about today, but On Our Backs was really in terms of the sort of feminist press, was quite ahead of its time in terms of how it was using technology, which was partly because of its location in San Francisco. It got a Mac desktop publisher very early on. There's an amazing image, which I haven't got, so it's annoying to describe it, but of all of the On Our Backs editorial team, the Mac desktop publisher in the centre, like a little baby. So, as we know, print culture incredibly important, and it helps to tell stories about the kind of roots of and emergence of all of photographic culture, really pre-internet, but sort of certainly lesbian photography in this instance. Print really moves through different spaces, so thinking about reading lesbian images moves through the space of the home, the use of home darkrooms, including kitchens and the Castro that transformed into darkrooms, and community darkrooms such as the DeBose Park Photo Centre just around the corner from Scott's Pit. Scott's Pit was a Bay Area lesbian bar where Della Grace Volcano shot early work, and you can see some of that work in this 1982 Samwa's newsletter. There was also the Harvey Milk Photo Lab, where Cottrell and other photographers, including Phyllis Christopher, printed their work. And then there was the spaces in which that work circulated, so Samwa's newsletter, Plexus, Lesbian Speak Out, Lesbian Tide, On the Rag, Big Mama Rag, Women's Press, Country Women, Women's Spirit, Sinister Wisdom, Blatant Image, Magazine of Feminist Photography, and so on. Ache. And then there were ad hoc gallery spaces, sometimes bars, cafes, clubs, for example. So in this sense, print promotes thinking about networks, the public lives of images, and that was why I wanted to sort of end the day by thinking about the home. Writing in a text from 2002, Corinne describes some of the images that were pinned around her own bedroom in the 1970s. They can be seen in this image, which is taken of Corinne in 1975, getting her first lesbian haircut. There's a lot of humour which I think can't be lost with these archives and our sort of connection to them, but also a sort of seriousness and thinking of these moments as ones that were sort of incredibly intimate and incredibly sort of radical at this time. Corinne talks about the images that you can see in this photograph. There's a drawing from life of a vulva. Corinne spent much of the 1970s photographing labias, and these were shown as slideshows at conferences such as Lesbian Her Story Exploration 1975, and in galleries such as the one above the Bacchanal, a women's bar in North Berkeley, California. And they also featured in her colouring book, which circulated widely. I think it sold about 23,000 copies. Was a Christmas stocking filler when it was first published in late 1975. So Corinne talks about these images which have been important to her, so important that she puts them on her bedroom wall. She also describes a photograph of Jacqueline Livingstone, a photographer whose class is where she met Corinne, is where she met Honey Lee Cottrell. And they used, her and Cottrell used a basement darkroom of UC Berkeley extension for a period. Looking at another image of the same event offers insight into other specific meanings of the home as a site of production of work that was often made between friends. In the words of Canadian writer Aubrey Thomas, which were quoted to Corinne by Joan Rule, we are each other's raw material. And images like these are reminiscent of the photography ovulas, which might be familiar to some of you, where lesbian participants would share food, sleeping space, and knowledge and ideas about photography. And this is a sort of now fairly widely circulated within certain communities image of one of the ovulas. These were facilitated by people like Corinne, Carol Niehaus, Joan and Vera and Ruth Mountain Grove. Honey Lee Cottrell's film Sweet Dreams also stages the home in specific ways, this time as a site of fantasy. Cottrell, a photographer who would be so central to On Our Backs that she appeared as the centerfold bull dagger of the season in the first edition of the magazine, honed her own practice working as a printer in San Francisco for Ruth Bernard. So a photographer really aligned with the tradition of American pictorialism. And some of you would be, well, I suppose, because I'm at the courtyard, that some of you might be familiar with Ruth Bernard's Image Two Forms. She was a bisexual photographer living in the West Coast area. And the 1963 photograph, intensely formal, shows two women lovers. Cottrell made the film for the National Sex Forum, where she also studied. It was her first film, a landmark in lesbian sex education. In her classic study of in his classic study of, I've just misgendered Richard Dyer. In his classic study of lesbian and gay cinema, Richard Dyer includes Sweet Dreams as one of only two films in the short section titled Towards Lesbian Erotica or Pornography. Located on this cusp, the film highlights convergence of erotic photography, progressive sex education, the sexual politics of the women's liberation movement, radical lesbian SM practices, and anti-racist positions that informed lesbian sex cultures of the 1980s. So it sort of precedes these and is a kind of moment of their coming together. But it also allows us to highlight issues with the emergence of the lesbian image, how that happened unevenly, as it does continue to do. although a film is instructive of how lesbian images were made and the spaces that they were made in this case a curtained apartment in San Francisco. 14 minutes long, the film is a lesbian masturbatory fantasy that follows the psychic desires of the protagonist through to climax. In that sense, it's very like a lot of pornography. It stars Pat Califia, the writer who once wrote that as a trans man, he was born of lesbian feminism. Onto the scene of lesbian feminism and the birth of new consciousness, Sweet Dreams opens with Martha Couteau's poem, Making Love to Myself, and uses plants and I'll go back to that. Uses plants and flowers as signifiers, as label imagery. A more explicit representation of lesbian sexuality develops as the film progresses. As Dyer wrote in the film in the early 1980s, although grounded in dominant motifs of cultural feminism, the insistent signalling of orgasm and the direct reference to smelling and tasting juices suggests a very different direction for lesbian erotica. So there's only 2 films included in this section towards lesbian erotica or pornography, and the other is Hammer's Dyke Tactics, although it was updated by Julian Piddock later, so this is a sort of earlier version of that book. Sweet Dreams does not start in the home, but on the street. Cottrell wrote in 1981 that she wished to turn her camera to the street of which she was part. This sense of homelessness, which was not some sort of cliched or kind of fetishized reference for these photographers. Many of these contributors struggled financially, indeed many of them continue to do so, did sex work, made their homes in San Francisco because they'd left families elsewhere. And in this sense, why San Francisco is the kind of centre of this sort of moment of lesbian sex cultures. Also because, as Corinne said, people in San Francisco were really willing to take their clothes off in the 1970s. So a jean-wearing, leather-jacket-clad Califia turns a key in the lock of the San Francisco walk-up. And this emergence of lesbian erotica in the 1970s necessitates a move out of the streets and into the home as the site of production of the image. In many images from this period and after, home studios are sometimes obscured by white sheets, but other times visible in images, mirrors, knickknacks, and so on. From the outset, lesbian sex photography was prescribed by repression and censorship surrounded it. Constraints had huge impact on the work that was made and how it was read. As Jan Zita Grover wrote of Tee Corinne's work in her 1988 essay, Likes in Context, I'm going to quote at length here, the social difficulties that would follow upon identification as a lesbian have moulded the photographer's decision to a considerable degree, resulting in a body of work on sexuality that cannot be understood in terms familiar to our academic analysis. That is, in fact, that it in fact looks coy and sentimental. So she's talking about images like this, by those institution standards, works that displace sexual feelings onto acceptable symbolic replacements so as to afford some measure of privacy. I'm not going to show screenshots from the whole of the film. There's a section in which Califia is shown on a chair looking at his labia with using a mirror. So sort of reflecting on and I'm trying to say. So sort of resonating with consciousness raising groups and the sort of activities of consciousness raising groups, and then it sort of slowly moves into this this fantasy as you move through. It never gets that. It doesn't. It also is a sort of another quite coy film. This is a really nice reference to Hammer wearing one of Barbara Hammer's T-shirts, and there's a kind of promise of a lot of things which are sort of bound up in this film, including a sort of pretty radical depiction of interracial sex at that time. Okay, so I'll carry on. So as Grove identifies the technique of solarization employed by Corinne, so now we're talking about these photographs, masks lesbian identity, even as it attempts an explicit image of lesbian desire. Corinne felt that the solarizations, images in which subjects merge with the backgrounds where the darkest, most hidden areas seem lit from within, were the most lesbian of all her work. Corinne described her practice as cunty, troublesome, and she began to grow fascinated by the results of the solarizations that work by exposing a print to light in the darkroom. She kept returning to the darkroom, searching for better control, more evocative results. So these are really works that are kind of made between desire and the sort of limitations of what can be shown. And part of the reason for sort of talking about this at length in relation to Sweet Dreams, the film, is that there's a desire for depictions of black women in these representations of and sort of fantasies about lesbian sex, but there were also enormous problems in terms, of course, of racism, but also in terms of anonymity. So another thing that the book really tracks is this sort of problem of anonymity and how that maps on to other sort of structural inequalities and sort of reckonings that are happening within this movement. Until the point that in the mid-90s, images start to circulate online, and that creates a massive issue in terms of the anonymity of models, and that issue sort of continues in terms of digitisation of these archives. So just to finish, within this project about lesbian sex photography, Sweet Dreams serves to sort of think about photography and film and how they were used simultaneously in the production of lesbian erotica and pornography, and this was something that, of course, increased with the availability of home video in the 1980s. Photography, smaller film formats and eventually video allowed increasing access to the means of reproduction for makers of lesbian erotica, which meant being able to avoid labs, so photographic labs that would often refuse to develop and print work. For similar reasons, the home was a sort of space for production and making of lesbian sex images, as occurs sort of more generally in the porn industry until you sort of get to a kind of level of studio work. The circulation of the print of Sweet Dreams was not through spaces of print, of course, but of projection. Though this meant it was returned sometimes to home screenings, shown in women's squats and other spaces. The life of photographs continues in the homes of photographers, so as Corinne describes, they did not simply sort of end there, making their way out into the world, but coming back into the home. And in a project that has often meant visiting photographers on their estate or their estates in their homes, this is an important insight. I'm going to end there, except that there was an older colleague once remarked that by the mid-1980s, Corinne's images were so ubiquitous that they were pinned to the bedroom wall of every woman that she slept with. So it's a nice circle. But yeah, thanks for your time and